In a conversation with a friend of mine, we were discussing the power of stories. Now, this isn't any individual. This is a mentor of mine. This is someone who has done sales at an international level, somebody who's really commands the power of persuasion. And the key element of our conversation was the benefits of using stories. I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. If you want to be more influential, persuasive, and build opportunities in your life, stories are an excellent way to connect with audiences and persuade consistently. Now, stories deliver a number of unique values. First off, in our conversation, he's putting together a book. He'd like to produce a little bit of residual income as he moves closer to retirement. And the key foundation of that book is the stories, the adventures, the life that others can live vicariously through his words. Now, that's what we want to do with our stories. Now, when I think about the stories I have, personally, the stories are not very interesting. I lived those experiences. They were beneficial to me. However, I don't think they're interesting. But when I share these same stories with clients or clients share their stories with me, it is the audience that ultimately who can judge. And that's kind of the key of what we're going to share. So there are 5 key things that stories can do in your written presentations, spoken presentations, and even day-to-day conversations. And there's a way to package these stories so that you can help organize information and make it easier to communicate. Now, everybody knows the guy who's told the same story 15 times. The story tends to define the individual, and we politely listen to the story, even though we've heard it so many times before. And we know of political figures that tell stories that are different every time. The key thing about a story in making it beneficial to persuade, engage, create credibility, inform, and demonstrate, and those are the key areas, is to make your stories consistent, to make them clear. And so how do we make your stories clear? First off, we're going to create an inventory of stories. Now, there are different types of stories. We're not going to talk about them here, but the intention of the story has to match the context of the story. If you're writing a story or recalling a story to be persuasive, the story must have a specific lesson. The audience must be able to relate to the story. They must be able to connect with what you're saying, and then you have a lesson tied to it. If you're going to get engagement with a story, the story needs to have depth and interest. So the story might start out, like I said earlier, I was talking with a friend on the phone and we were talking about stories. It has to open up questions. Well, what were you talking about stories? Why is that important? What does it mean to me? The engagement element of the story is the relevant connection for the audience. Not necessarily you connecting with the audience, but the story needs to connect with the audience's own interests and desires. Parables often do this because they are interesting and the listener wants some payoff. And so you can split stories in half. So at the beginning you have the intro to the story, and then you have some key points. The audience is waiting for the next part of that story. And then finally you finish to conclude and close that what's called an open loop. Now, in order to do that, your story must be credible. If I tell you the story of how I single-handedly stopped an airplane from mid-flight, and if it sounds like a superhero story, that's going to be a little bit harder to believe. I don't have superhuman strengths. While it might be considered that I have a above average understanding of the world around me, the story must be credible. Now, how do we make stories credible? Well, stories that are verifiable are more credible than stories that sound like they're just made up. Now, you can have an amazing and incredible story that you'll have to find evidence for. But in the case of a lot of business stories, so a lot of my client stories, I can't go into detail about a client story because we have confidentiality. So we solve complex problems in a discrete way. I wouldn't be discreet if I was describing these unique and complex problems and then giving you the answers to the problems, because then you could easily identify the audience. While I have very limited information on my LinkedIn profile, it's not impossible to figure out who I've worked for in the past. And so we want to be credible while protecting the confidentiality of our clients. And so we might have to have an analog story, or we might have to find someone else's story in the marketplace to convey the same information. But again, it has to be credible, because the story is tied to your own credibility, but it's tied to the believability of who you are. Now, you can have stories that are informing, so you can have a story that is instructive, and it's the same demonstration story over and over that is educating the audience. So a professor may have this. Now, if you're positioning yourself as a thought leader, for example, then you might tell a story that's illustrative, even persuasive, but ultimately informs the audience about maybe a new approach that's available. Now, when I say there are 5 benefits to telling stories, these aren't the only 5 benefits. There are additional benefits. The key is these are the ones that are most easy to start with. Finally, there's the demonstration. Your story could demonstrate the results of applying a certain procedure. It could demonstrate the success that you can deliver to clients. It can demonstrate how to do something. So you're combining informing and demonstration to actually walk someone through the steps. And ultimately, a demonstration, the customer has to see something. Now, when I say see something, we're using all of our senses to make these stories interesting. A persuasive story that has no emotional hook to it is kind of like instructions. Instructions with no practical outcome is kind of a waste of time. See, the stories help you organize information to communicate it in a meaningful way. The story has a beginning, middle, and end. The story has could have 3 acts. It could have a point of conflict. It could have specific characters that are in that story. All of these elements are to be carefully crafted before you present the story. Now, I know off the cuff, some people are better at storytelling than others. They can have the conversational tone. They can make it easy to follow by naturally explaining how things happened. They can use the pace of language to keep the listener following along the story. But the story itself is a memory mnemonic to help you recall information. Now, our brains don't perfectly recall information, so there is a high probability of your story being told today being told different in the future, because you're actually a different person in the future. Your thoughts and experiences have changed. So a story that was meaningful when you were young may not have any value when you're older. So the key is to write down these stories. So inside your business or your consultancy or your professional career, you're going to have a series of stories that are going to help you answer specific questions of your audience. Now, for a lot of job seekers, those stories are responses to, for example, tell me a little bit about your experience in this area and one of the challenges that you faced and how you overcame it. So your story is connected specifically to the ask of your audience. So you might use a STAR formula or a WHO formula, and we can go into those formulas in another place, but there are actual formulas that you can follow. If you have a story that is persuasive, you can use an AIDA formula, which is attention, interest, desire, and action. Or you could use a formula, problem, pain, solution, action. Either way, your story can be framed in both ways. It can be, hey, have you experienced the problem? Here's how you might approach it, and then here's a solution I recommend. Or that story can be how I faced the problem, what options were available, or what were the characteristics of that problem in relationship to the company, and then how did I address it. You can use the same story for both of those formulas. The key is that you are taking into consideration your audience, the context of the story, the outcome and purpose of the story, and then ultimately what is the chronological framework of that story. Now, most stories are in a chronological order. You can use more advanced storytelling techniques by starting with the end. Here's the outcome that happened. Let's talk about how they got there. You can start with the problem and move through to a solution. You can start with the experiences of the characters. It doesn't really matter. The key is that you want to invest in writing down your stories, and you must understand that the more you write down these stories, the less interesting they will be to you. So now, knowing they're not very interesting to you, because you've told the story more than once, and you've got a new audience, they've never heard the story, but you have to add the drama to it. You have to add the color. You have to add the emotion. You have to add the descriptive language. And again, that's what these 5 points are about. How could I make my story more persuasive? How can I make my story more engaging? How can I make the story more credible? How can I make the story more informing? How can I make this story demonstrate something? When you do these stories, it will take you a lifetime of processing. That's why older people are better with stories than younger people. They have more context to put into the story. But you've got to be careful not to put too much into your stories. So you're going to write an inventory of your stories, and these are going to be your successes. They're going to be demonstrative of your skill set. They're going to be the typical stories you put in a job interview. Then you're going to have stories of your products and services. Then you're going to have stories of your customers. You're going to have stories hypersomnia kicking in. Then you're going to have stories that are developed for specific purposes. When you build all these things into a notebook, you can start with the stories that you commonly tell, but you need a third party to look at these stories to make them interesting, to extract key elements. And that's what I do. When I'm doing copywriting for a client, when I'm helping them build a persuasive presentation, when I'm helping them position themselves as an expert in a marketplace, we go through these stories and we make them interesting for an audience. They may not be interesting to you. I bore myself with my stories when I'm developing a story or I'm writing down the story. I don't think they're very interesting, but then when a client hears it, they're like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I needed to hear in order to get started with implementing this particular process or taking this particular action. So again, there are benefits of using stories in your communications. These benefits include making it easier for you to present and making your presentation more persuasive or the things that we're talking about here. How do you get to that point? Well, it takes work. It takes work to write down the story. It takes work to cultivate the story. And then once you do this, you're more likely to be consistent with your story. It's more likely to be credible. But the last thing I want to leave you with is don't embellish your story. You can improve your ability to speak, your ability to convey information, and your ability to tell a story. But if you embellish your story, especially to the point where it's now a fictional story, it takes a lot more effort to keep it straight. It also could put you under legal liability. It could put you in a situation where something that could be verified as inconsistent could damage your credibility. But ultimately, you actually do have good stories. You may not realize it, but there are things and experiences and opportunities and what your life has become that would be interesting to somebody. It is easier and safer to just find an audience that will find your story interesting than it is to make your story something that it was not originally. There's a cognitive disconnect that happens when you tell a lie. And a story that is not accurate, a story that's been overly embellished, is a lie. And what will happen is if you keep telling a story that is a lie, you're going to refine it, you're going to change it, and then it's going to be detrimental. A lot of politicians do this, by the way. A politician that keeps telling a story differently every time or adapts the story, overly adapts it for a particular audience, is lying. So you're going to get more out of it, especially in a professional environment, if you cultivate stories that are true. And then you present those stories in a way that's meaningful. You present those stories in a way that's persuasive. You present those stories in a way that's engaging. Anyway, I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. And if you want to sit down and go over a consultation or a strategic working session to talk about your story, I do find that I can make other people's stories. The story is interesting of in itself, but I can highlight the elements that are valuable to a specific audience. So, for example, if you're a selling professional and you want to tell better stories that close more sales, usually a conversation we can come up with better stories, and you'll look at your own story and be like, wow, I didn't think about it that way. And that's the key. Stories help change minds, and so you want to be able to convey the truth of the story in a way that delivers the outcome that you're looking for. And that's one of the things that I do for clients. I'm Justin Hitt again. If you have questions about storytelling, the use of words and persuasion, how to make yourself sound more interesting even if you don't believe you are, then visit www.insidestrategicrelations.com, because those questions will help you unlock the relationship value. Stories create connection in relationships, and ultimately turn business relationships into profits. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next podcast.